If we're going to leave something behind, I think it's one of the better things you can leave behind is something that makes people feel more like themselves and not the person they think they ought to be, and that they are at peace with the fact that they're going to transition just like those before them and those after.
Hello, passionate listeners and watchers. Welcome to Passion Harvest. I am Louisa, your host. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you are in the world right now. I'm so excited about our guest today, Ben Riggs. Ben Riggs is a retired US Navy pilot and shares his knowledge of spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs. In the military, NDEs, UFOs, STEs, and reincarnation were usually only quietly and privately talked about. After years of research, today Ben shares his findings. Ben Riggs is co-founder of the Rhode Island IANDS group and teaches a course called What Happens When We Die. This is his story and this is his passion. Ben Riggs, welcome to Passion Harvest.
Thank you for having me. You have a very interesting program that covers an awful lot of ground.
Well, from all your research, if you wouldn't mind just putting in simple terms for the audience, how would you define consciousness?
Well, consciousness can't be measured, weighed, photographed, the way you do in material science. But it's hard to do that with gravity too. Consciousness is another dimension. It's not a part of our existing physical dimension. And so consciousness, to me, as I've learned over the years from my wife, who was an experiencer who had a very interesting NDE, and from the hundreds of people I have met from being involved with IANDS and other groups and running the NDE group here in Newport for the last 6 or 7 years, I've heard enough to believe that consciousness is something that exists separately, that's part of the oneness of the universe, and it occupies physical bodies while they're on Earth, the same way a driver occupies a car in a way. In other words, you could do things together that neither of you could do by yourselves. We've just come to understand that this consciousness is something that occupies your brain, and your brain operates like a TV set. The TV set does not create the show you're watching, and you won't find the actors hidden inside the back of it. It's passing through the air and you can't see it, but it's being grabbed by this device that has been created to process it so that you can see it and hear it. And I believe that our brains do that. Part of our brains have their own operating system, which is things like food, sex, sleep, protection, things that keep the human being alive and pass Darwin's test for survival. But the rest of it are all the other things that we're talking about now. And those things exist, including identity, who you are, as well as being a part of something greater. Those were here before you occupied your body, and they're still around after your body's gone. I think we have enough preponderance of the evidence to show that that's the case.
Well, thank you for explaining that so well. And I mentioned in your introduction that you work or co-founded IANDS, and you teach a course called What Happens When We Die. What happens when we die? Or I should say when our physical body dies.
Okay, well, I think there is a filter in your brain that filters out 99% of what's passing through it. Cosmic knowledge and incredible things that your consciousness is capable of. But we as humans, we can't operate at that speed. If everything's already happened in a billionth of a second, and we can't keep up with that. So we're living in a slow motion created by a filter in our brains. And that filter goes away when your brain stops functioning. And once the filter goes away, it releases your consciousness from the limitations of your body. And you step out of that car that broke down, and now you're like Superman and you can fly away, but you do it into another dimension. And that's when you discover that wasn't your home, it was an assignment. And you're going back home, and you have an understanding of the entire universe in the sense that you're part of it, it's part of you, and that it is a loving, comforting, inclusive, non-judgmental thing that you belong to somehow, and there's no head and there's no tail to it. And you suddenly have this incredible view of what is this world all about, or why am I in it, and why is everybody suffering, and what's going on back there on Earth? And that's what we talk about. I think the demographics of the groups that I teach are mostly people over 60 in lifelong learning programs and so forth. Their interest is, what happens to me when I die.
Yeah.
But by then they've lost some very, very loved, close people, and they want to know what happened when they died, and are they still there? Do they know if I'm okay? How do I know if they're okay wherever they are now? I find that's one of the greatest things, particularly somebody who's lost a child. They will come into my group and they will say, I want to know if she's okay, because she's somewhere. And so those are the first two reasons that I think they come. I think the other part about looking at the world as a whole, and reincarnation and the evolution of mankind come later.
For those that are unable to connect with loved ones, and sure the suffering is greater, what would you say to them?
I say to them that they can see you, and if it's right, you'll be able to see them. They're just fine. You will be too when it's your time. And in the meantime, that doesn't mean you're not supposed to miss their being here now physically. You absolutely should and could and will, and it's better for you to take your grieving as it comes. Everybody grieves differently. Some people are back on their feet in a month, and some people it takes a year. Don't hold a stopwatch up. Don't let anybody tell you to hurry up and grieve. It's a process you have to go through, which is not having that person with you now. But remember, you do have something in the future where you will see them again. The part of you that matters will see them again. And I think that's all we could do. It's not something that I had growing up. When I was 5, I watched as my mother went racing down to the river, and my 2 older brothers had broken through the ice and they drowned.
I'm sorry.
And I don't think I'm over that today. And why was I spared? And what am I here for? And that was something that hung over on me. And my grieving took decades. And my mother, God knows how she got through that. Mm. But she did. She had 2 more children.
Gosh, I mean, yes, the suffering that we can endure in our consciousness or our soul and our human form can be quite significant.
Well, they can. And my father was a psychiatrist, and he's supposed to know how to deal with these things. And when it came down to happening in his life, it wasn't quite so easy. But I think he fared better than my mother did. So I think that part of life is extremely difficult for all of us, and that's okay. If it was all easy, we'd probably be bored and drink ourselves to death. So.
Maybe. I mean, look, there's one thing for absolute certain, that we are all going to transition to die at some point in time.
Yes.
It happens to all of us.
It happens to all of us, and we never seem to know why or when. You know, why did that person get struck by lightning and I was standing over here and I didn't? Okay, is that chance or is that part of some greater plan? And I think we believe there is a plan because people who have had NDEs have had the opportunity to talk about the plan, and the fact that the plan does not call for them to die right now. They're going to have to go back and finish what they started. And as we know, in most cases, people don't want to go back. I don't care how happy their life is back on Earth, they don't want to go back.
I'd like to move on to an exciting topic, and I know you've done quite a bit of research on this, spiritually transformative experiences in the military. I'm just going to leave this one wide open for you to chat about whatever you feel called to.
Well, I started out as a skeptic on that. I mean, I remember in my earlier days before I was flying a single engine jet of a carrier, I was a navigator on a C-130 that was doing some hush-hush stuff, experimenting with various things. And we were in a restricted area, I remember, between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, I guess you would say, in the the Bermuda Triangle. And this is back when Pan Am was still in business, and one of their jets had taken a shortcut to San Juan through our restricted area. We were up around 30,000 feet and 28,000, something like that. Was about all we could get up to. And the pilots radioed in that a flying saucer just went right back across in front of them at a high rate of speed, and it was definitely a flying saucer. It was cone-shaped. It had no visible means of support. And off it went. Well, we kind of chuckled because we were the ones controlling that thing. And those pilots are telling their grandchildren today that they saw an alien craft. Okay, so we knew that one wasn't true. And there were others, but then we had other things pop up where we couldn't explain it. One of my colleagues had tracked on an early warning plane, had tracked a target going across his scope at 4,400 miles an hour. We don't have anything that goes that fast. 4,400 miles an hour. And when he reported it, the first thing they did was send him to see the shrink. And after they determined, well, it seems to be okay, they asked him a bit about it, said, okay, well, just, you don't need to write it down anywhere or report the incident, we'll take it from here. That was the end of it. And the culture was, if it's something that upsets our sense of security, I don't know if I would call it security, but it's unsettling to our world as we perceive it. And another dimension is unsettling, if you want to be unsettled. Doesn't unsettle me, I think it's great, but for many, then I can see that that's something that you would cover up and you would bury it. But then I find out years later that there have been other things that took place, and one was everybody talks about the incident in Roswell because there's the conspiracy theorists, and then there are people say it's no such thing ever happened, where a spacecraft crashed there. And it happened, and again, you can talk about synchronicity or what you will, but there was a man who was one of the professors that I had teaching courses to people, in the senior group. And I knew this guy for 15 years. He was a PhD, and he used to be a director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is where we do our atomic weapons research. And he found out I was teaching this course. He said, what is this all about? And I told him at lunch one day that, this is what it's all about. He says, I had one of those. And next thing we know, find out his story, which is he had a heart attack on a ski lift, which is very, a poor place to have a heart attack. and extremely inconvenient. And at any rate, he died on the way to the hospital, and he had his NDE. And he said that I've never really talked to anybody about this before. But you actually have a group that talks about it. So in the course of all this, it turned out that his roommate in the cardiac unit at the hospital later contacted him after they got released from the hospital. And they went to lunch, and his roommate said, I was a deputy sheriff right there at Roswell, when, the same place you were at. He says, I've never told anybody this story in my life. But he says, I was there when it happened. I was the first one on the scene. And he said, I called for backup, and other sheriff's department people and police showed up. The next thing we knew, there were a bunch of military people there. And they said, get the hell out of here. And we said, no, this is in our jurisdiction. They said, no, you get the hell out of here. And they had more people and more guns than we did. So we decided, okay. And they said to us, if you ever breathe a word of this to anyone, you and your families will disappear. And he decided he'd stay behind and hide in the bushes. And he did.
Oh my gosh.
And he saw them kick. And he saw 4 different people being taken out on stretchers, and they were still alive and in pain or something, moving about. And they took 4 of them out of there. And so that's that story.
Were they
now,
did he identify them as humans? Did they look like humans?
No, they were smaller, and they were smaller, and they were different. They were totally different.
So he definitely stated that they were extraterrestrials.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, now that's an interesting story. I always look for some kind of an independent confirmation. Well, it turns out that the vice president of IANDS, and I were talking about it, which is the International Association of Near-Death Studies, for those who don't know, and he's a retired California highway patrolman who ended up with an NDE, and is now sort of part of our group of woo-woo people. And he said, I have a friend who was a Navy SEAL, which is, of course, their first on the line combat SWAT team type people, who was on the scene and in charge, or at least of his group. And he was there, and he said, yes, there were 4 people, and they were being carried off. And we were told if any of us there in the military ever told a soul, including our spouses, that we and our families would disappear. Same words.
Interesting.
And he and that deputy sheriff didn't know each other. Okay, so that corroborates the story. Now, what happened after that, we don't know. It's possible they lived on. It's, the rumors that one of them met with Eisenhower in the middle of the night, at Edwards Air Force Base. If you ever heard that story, there's no way to confirm it. If you give up your nukes, which are going to disturb the balance of the universe, if a whole bunch of them go off at the same time, if you're willing to give them up, we'll give you our technology and our spiritual wisdom.
There's so many theories and stories. What's your thoughts on life on other planets, in other dimensions? I'm particularly referring to extraterrestrials that we're talking about, or UFOs.
I think that if you look at the size of the universe, if you can even contemplate it, and the mathematical possibilities, chances are that there is intelligent life other than ours in the universe is far greater than that there is not. That life exists. It's not necessarily just like us. When our NASA people get excited, they find some planet and say, well, let's see, does it have oxygen or does it have water? Because that's what you need to sustain life. I always laugh and say, what makes them think that everything in the universe needs oxygen and water to be alive? They're not people like us. They could even be people that are in another dimension. They could even be in a parallel universe. Who the hell knows?
Anything's possible. I always say that.
Yeah, and it is anything possible because of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned now that you're running IANDS and you're a bit woo-woo, as you called it yourself. Have you had people, former colleagues from the military, come to you talking either about UFOs or any of their own personal spiritually transformative experiences?
Yes, some have had out of bodies, usually in conjunction with a trauma, a near miss crash or, something like that, where they actually went outside of their bodies, didn't talk about it. I know military people who have had problems because their wife had one. One of my colleagues in the Naval Reserves, he was an engineering officer. He got divorced, and we were asking him why. How come, your wife and your daughter? I thought you were really close to them. Everything was great. And he said, well, when she had that stroke and she almost died, ever since then she hasn't been the same. She's been a total nutcase. I mean, she's got this like a vision of the world. She's not accepting any kind of materialism. She thinks everything's built on love and blah blah blah. And this isn't the woman I married. I don't know what's happened to her, but I just can't relate to her anymore, and she can't relate to me. So we're getting divorced.
Very common after a near-death experience, and very common that family members have said they're just not the same person when they returned to life. Why are you so, I'm just interested, you're doing wonderful, wonderful work and alleviating so much fear, but why are you passionate about NDEs and helping other people about life after death and what happens when we die? What motivates you?
Well, certainly having been around it, starting at the age of 5, but I think because there are a lot of ways that you could give back. If you've had a life like I have and my wife has, and where we believe we must have been in the same soul group and we must have been here before, and we were here for a reason. There are a lot of ways you could give, and I think the worst is and the least effective is money. It just goes into the same hole, and we've seen that around the world. It doesn't seem to make anybody better off. It results maybe in more people who aren't better off. That's about it. Or it's a Band-Aid approach. If we're going to leave something behind, I think one of the better things you can leave behind is something that makes people feel more like themselves and not the person they think they ought to be, and that they are at peace with the fact that they're going to transition just like those before them and those after. I think both of those things are very important in terms of people's happiness on the planet, the way they treat each other, and more importantly, the way they treat themselves. And I remember once we were a family that always had a dinner around the dinner table formally every night, and all 5 of us. And I remember when I was about 16 or so. 16 is an age where you're really quite omniscient. You really understand everything there is in the world, and you can always reduce it to a single sentence, which your parents always called a one-liner. So anyway, I had that massive ability when I was 16, and I turned to my father one night and said, "Dad," he being a psychiatrist, "since we all know people don't change, what is it exactly you try to do with your patients?" And there was silence in the room, and my mother looked at the ceiling like, "Oh God, he's going to get sent to his room again." But my father thought for a moment, then he said, "Well, I don't try to change anyone. I just try to increase the ratio of their voluntary actions to their involuntary ones.
Good answer.
Yes, and that stuck with me as, okay, accepting the person the way they are, and he wants them to do the same. And I think if you can leave the world a little bit better than you found it, that's really your job when you're here. And I think this is one way to leave it. And I do think there is some sort of Maharaji effect where you see there's a ripple effect where you do the tiniest little thing and you find out 3 years later, that one day when you said something to me, boy, did that make a difference in my life. I said, what? But it's true. The tiniest things that you do can have a ripple effect that add to making the world a better place and people in it feeling that sense. And I think that's why people gravitate towards the research that was done by Sheldrake, who did his experiments with rats and their consciousness and swimming through mazes, and find out that consciousness went from his rats, which took 20 tries to get through the maze. Once they learned, so did the rats in Scotland, and so did the rats in Australia at the same time. Now, how the hell did that happen?
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Consciousness. And how do you have things like entanglement, where you could split a proton, take it thousands of miles away, and you turn one half here and watch the other one turn there at the same time? They're connected. And we don't understand how it works, but we don't need to. And so I think sharing that with people, even if you only reach 10 or 20% of them, makes it very effective. If you even reach one of them, is worthwhile.
Well, that's what I always say. Even if this episode helps one person, my job is done. So I absolutely agree with you. Ben, I've asked all the questions. Is there something you'd like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that I haven't asked you?
I suppose I would just add that, people's ability to withstand trauma is very, very different from person to person. And in the culture we were in, I had a number of friends who were shot down over North Vietnam, and they were POWs, and they went through years of torture, and then not knowing if they'd ever be free again. And I spent a fair amount of time with a number of them afterwards, as well as reading debriefs from them. And regardless of their backgrounds, they withstood that incredibly well, and they came out of it incredibly well. And a lot of them stayed in the Navy and continued to serve until their retirement. Others didn't. But their spouses didn't deal well with having somebody come back 5 years later. But I mean, they did and they didn't, because they had become independent. Or maybe worse, they were with someone else. But I think the fact that they came out of it being more spiritual, and I knew several who were that way. You could sense it when you walked in the room or when you sat and talked to them about anything. We had, I think, 2 commanders who were commanding squadrons on my ship, and they were the ones who would go out of their way and come down to where I was and say, "Thank you for doing a good job," or things like that other people wouldn't bother to do. And they were that kind of people. And
they were POWs, prisoners of war.
POWs for a long period of time. Yeah. And I think that shows that there's an incredible resilience, and that love can come out of it instead of anger. And I think that's something that we can all share in, and we can all help spread around and keep our minds open.
Yeah. Well, what a great way to end the show, Ben Briggs. Thank you so much for being on Passion Harvest. You've really offered so much to the audience, and I just want to again say thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. Bye, Ben. If you liked this episode, please do subscribe for weekly passionate, inspirational interviews.